There we are, and hello everybody. Here we are for another story time. I'll just put my little tiara in if I can get it to go in. I hope it doesn't fall out. There you go. So I hope you're having a wonderful week. This is the end of a wonderful week for you. If not, I hope you can find something that is pleasant that you can have as just a nice thing for you that has happened this week. Sometimes it's what's happening in your head that's not what's happening in real life. So that's some of the choices we sometimes have to make. Have you got your water to drink when we have a chapter break? Well, you can drink it anytime you like, but I'll be having mine on a chapter break. Some snacks, I've got peanuts, and I've got the book to read on my iPad mini. First generation, and it still works for books. So that's the big thing for me. It's nice and easy for reading books from, so just try and get this to go to the chapter. Here we go. We are reading A Little Princess, and it is written by a lady called Frances Hodgson Burnett, and I'm pretty sure you can find out more about her on Wikipedia and probably lots of other places. She was born in England, but she spent a lot of time, I think, well, quite a bit of time living in the States, but also lived back in England again at different times in her life. So we are reading A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and we are reading chapter 11, is where we're starting today. And the chapter is called Ram Das, or Ram Das. I'm not quite sure how it's meant to be said. There were fine sunsets even in the square sometimes. One could only see parts of them, however, between the chimneys and over the roofs. Hang on, I'm just going to click somewhere else so that red line is not distracting me. One could only see parts of them between the chimneys and over the roofs. From the kitchen windows one could not see them at all, and could only guess that they were going on because the bricks looked warm and the air rosy or yellow for a while, or perhaps one saw a blazing glow strike a particular pane of glass somewhere. There was, however, one place from which one could see all the splendour of them, the piles of red or gold clouds in the west, or the purple ones edged with dazzling brightness, or the little fleecy ones, floating ones, tinged with rose colour and looking like flights of pink doves scurrying across the blue in a great hurry if there was a wind. The place where one could see all this and seem at the same time to breathe a purer air was, of course, the attic window. When the square suddenly seemed to begin to glow in an enchanted way and look wonderful in spite of its sooty trees and railings, Sara knew something was going on in the sky, and when it was at all possible to leave the kitchen without being missed or called back, she invariably stole away and crept up the flights of stairs, and climbing on the old table, got her head and body as far out of the window as possible. When she had accomplished this, she always drew a long breath and looked all round her. It used to seem as if she had all the sky and the world to herself. No one else ever looked out of the other attics. Generally the skylights were closed, but even if they were propped open to admit air, no one seemed to come near them. And there Sara would stand, sometimes turning her face upward to the blue, which seemed so friendly and near, just like a lovely vaulted ceiling, sometimes watching the west and all the wonderful things that happened there, the clouds melting or the drifting or waiting softly to be changed pink or crimson or snow white or purple or pale dove grey. Sometimes they made islands or great mountains enclosing lakes of deep turquoise blue or liquid amber or chrysoprase green. Sometimes dark headlands jutted into strange lost seas. Sometimes slender strips of wonderful lands joined other wonderful lands together. There were places where it seemed that one could run or climb or wait or stand to see what next was coming, until perhaps, as it all melted, one could float away. At least it seemed so to Sara, and nothing had ever been quite so beautiful to her as the things she saw as she stood on the table, her body half out of the skylight, the sparrows twittering with sunset softness on the slates, The sparrows always seemed to her to twitter with a sort of subdued softness just when these marvels were going on. There was such a sunset as this a few days after the Indian gentleman was brought to his new home, and as it fortunately happened that the afternoon's work was done in the kitchen, and nobody had ordered her to go anywhere or perform any task, Sara found it easier than usual to slip away and go upstairs. She mounted her table and stood looking out. It was a wonderful moment. There were floods of molten gold covering the west, as if a glorious tide was sweeping over the world. A deep, rich, yellow light filled the air. The birds flying across the tops of the houses showed quite black against it. "Isn't it a splendid one?" said Sara softly to herself. "It makes me feel almost afraid, as if something strange was just going to happen. The splendid ones always make me feel like that." She suddenly turned her head because she heard a sound a few yards away from her. It was an odd sound, like a queer little squeaky chattering. It came from the window of the next attic. Someone had come to look at the sunset, as she had. There was a head and part of a body emerging from the skylight, but it was not the head or body of a little girl or a housemaid. It was the picturesque, white-swathed form and dark-faced, gleaming-eyed, white-turbaned head of a native Indian manservant. "A lascar," Sara said to herself quickly, and the sound she had heard came from a small monkey he held in his arms, as if he were fond of it, and which was snuggling and chattering against his chest. As Sara looked toward him, he looked toward her. The first thing she thought was that his dark face looked sorrowful and homesick. She felt absolutely sure he had come up to look at the sun, because he had seen it so seldom in England that he longed for a sight of it. She looked at him interestedly for a second and then smiled across the slates. She had learned to know how comforting a smile, even from a stranger, may be. Hers was evidently a pleasure to him. His whole expression altered, and he showed such gleaming white teeth as he smiled back that it was as if a light had been illuminated in his face. The friendly look in Sara's eyes was always very effective when people felt tired or dull. It was perhaps in making his salute to her that he loosened his hold on the monkey. He was an impish monkey, and always ready for adventure, and it is probable that the sight of a little girl excited him. He suddenly broke loose, jumped onto the slates, ran across them chattering, and actually leapt onto Sara's shoulder, and from there down into her attic room. It made her laugh and delighted her, but she knew he must be restored to his master, if the lascar was his master. I think a lascar is maybe a different group of people who live in India, but I'm not sure. Maybe that's a word you can look up. And she wondered how this was to be done. Would he let her catch him? Or would he be naughty and refuse to be caught, and perhaps get away and run off over the roofs and be lost? That would not do at all. Perhaps he belonged to the Indian gentleman, and the poor man was fond of him. She turned to the lascar, feeling glad that she had remembered some of the Hindustani she had learned when she lived with her father. She could make the man understand. She spoke to him in the language he knew. "Will he let me catch him?" she asked. She thought she had never seen more surprise and delight than the dark face expressed when she spoke in the familiar tongue. The truth was that the poor fellow felt as if his gods had intervened, and the kind little voice came from heaven itself. At once Sara saw that he had been accustomed to European children. He poured forth a flood of respectful thanks. He was the servant of Missy Sahib. The monkey was a good monkey and would not bite, but unfortunately he was difficult to catch. He would flee from one spot to another like the lightning. He was disobedient, though not evil. Ram Das knew him as if he were his child, and Ram Das he would sometimes obey, but not always. If Missy Sahib would permit Ram Das, he himself could cross the roof to her room, enter the windows, and regain the unworthy little animal. But he was evidently afraid Sara might think he was taking a great liberty, and perhaps would not let him come. But Sara gave him leave at once. "Can you get across?" she inquired. "In a moment," he answered. "Then come," she said. "He is flying from side to side of the room as if he was frightened." Ram Das slipped through his attic window and crossed to hers as steadily and lightly as if he had walked on roofs all his life. He slipped through the skylight and dropped upon his feet without a sound. Then he turned to Sara and salaamed again. The monkey saw him and uttered a little scream. Ram Dass hastily took the precaution of shutting the skylight and went in chase of him. It was not a very long chase. The monkey prolonged it a few minutes, evidently for the mere fun of it. But presently he sprang, chattering, onto Ram Dass's shoulder, and sat there chattering and clinging to his neck, with a weird little skinny arm. Ram Dass thanked Sara profoundly. She had seen his quick native eyes, had taken in at a glance all the bare shabbiness of the room, but he spoke to her as if he was speaking to the little daughter of a Rajah, and pretended that he had observed nothing. He did not presume to remain more than a few moments after he had caught the monkey, and those moments were given to further deep and grateful obeisance to her in return for her indulgence. This little evil one, he said, stroking the monkey, was in truth not so evil as he seemed, and his master, who was ill, was sometimes amused by him. He would have been made sad if his favourite had run away and been lost. Then he salaamed once more, that means bowing and gesturing in respect, and got through the skylight and across the slates again, with as much agility as the monkey himself had displayed. When he had gone, Sara stood in the middle of her attic and thought of many things his face and his manner had brought back to her. I'm just going to move my chair a little and try and get it so it doesn't squeak so much. Sorry. There you go. Not quite so sparkly in the corner behind the chair. The sight of his native costume and the profound reverence of his manner stirred up all her past memories. It seemed a strange thing to remember that she, the drudge whom the cook had said insulting things to an hour ago, had only a few years ago been surrounded by people who all treated her as Ram Dass had treated her, who salaamed when she went by, whose foreheads almost touched the ground when she spoke to them, because they would bow, who were her servants and her slaves. It was like a sort of dream. It was all over, and it could never come back. It certainly seemed that there was no way in which any change could take place. She knew what Miss Minchin intended that her future should be. So long as she was too young to be used as a regular teacher, she would be used as an errand girl and a servant, and yet expected to remember what she had learned, and in some mysterious way to learn more. The greater number of her evenings she was supposed to spend at study, and at various indefinite intervals she was examined, and knew she would have been severely admonished if she had not advanced as was expected of her. So she was having to teach herself from the books that were left in the room. The truth indeed was that Miss Minchin knew she was too anxious to learn to require teachers. In other words, she was going to try jolly hard, and she would therefore learn. Give her books and she would devour them and end by knowing them by heart. She might be trusted to be equal to teaching a good deal in the course of a few years. This is what would happen. When she was older, she would be expected to drudge in the schoolroom, that's doing servant's work, as she drudged now in various parts of the house. They would be obliged to give her more respectable clothes, but they would be sure to be plain and ugly, and to make her look somehow like a servant. That was all there seemed to be to look forward to, and Sara stood quite still for several minutes and thought it over. Then a thought came back to her which made the colour rise in her cheek, and a spark light itself in her eyes. She straightened her thin little body and lifted her head. "Whatever comes," she said, "cannot alter one thing. If I am a princess in rags and tatters, I can be a princess inside. It would be easy to be a princess if I were dressed in cloth of gold, but it is a great deal more triumph to be one all the time when no one knows it. There was Marie Antoinette when she was in prison, and her throne was gone, and she had only a black gown on, and her hair was white, and they insulted her and called her Widow Capet. She was a great deal more like a queen then than when she was so happy and everything was so grand. I like her best then. Those howling mobs of people did not frighten her. She was stronger than they were, even when they cut her head off." This was not a new thought, but quite an old one by this time. It had consoled her through many a bitter day, and she had gone about the house with an expression in her face which Miss Minchin could not understand, and which was a source of great annoyance to her, as it seemed as if the child were mentally living a life which held her above the rest of the world. It was as if she scarcely heard the rude and acid things said to her, or if she heard them, did not care for them at all. Sometimes when she was in the midst of some harsh, domineering speech, Miss Minchin would find the still, unchildish eyes fixed upon her with something like a proud smile in them. At such times she did not know that Sara was saying to herself, "You do not know that you are saying these things to a princess, and that if I chose, I could wave my hand and order you to execution. I only spare you because I am a princess, and you are a poor, stupid, unkind, vulgar old thing, and don't know any better." This used to interest and amuse her more than anything else, and queer and fanciful as it was, she found comfort in it, and it was a good thing for her. While the thought held possession of her, she could not be made rude and malicious by the rudeness and malice of those about her. A princess must be polite, she said to herself, and so when the servants, taking their tone from their mistress, were insolent and ordered her about, she would hold her head erect and reply to them with a quaint civility which often made them stare at her. "She's got more airs and graces than if she came from Buckingham Palace, that one," said the cook, chuckling a little sometimes. "I lose my temper with her often enough, but I will say she never forgets her manners. If you please, cook, will you be so kind, cook? I beg your pardon, cook. May I trouble you, cook? She drops 'em about the kitchen as if they was nothing." The morning after the interview with Ram Dass and his monkey, Sara was in the schoolroom with her small pupils. Sorry, I thought the light next to me was flickering, but I don't know if it was. She was in the schoolroom with her small pupils. Having finished giving them their lessons, she was putting the French exercise books together and thinking, as she did it, of the various things royal personages in disguise were called upon to do. Alfred the Great, for instance, burning the cakes and getting his ears boxed by the wife of the neatherd. How frightened she must have been when she found out what she had done, that she had boxed the ears of Alfred the Great. If Miss Minchin should find out that she, Sara, whose toes were almost sticking out of her boots, was a princess, a real one, the look in her eyes was exactly the look which Miss Minchin most disliked. She would not have it. She was quite near her and was so enraged that she actually flew at her and boxed her ears, exactly as the neatherd's wife had boxed King Alfred's. It made Sara start. She wakened from her dream at the shock and, catching her breath, stood still a second. Then, not knowing she was going to do it, she broke into a little laugh. "What are you laughing at, you bold, impudent child?" Miss Minchin exclaimed. It took Sara a few seconds to control herself sufficiently to remember that she was a princess. Her cheeks were red and smarting from the blows she had received. "I was thinking," she answered. "Beg my pardon immediately," said Miss Minchin. Sara hesitated a second before she replied. "I will beg your pardon for laughing, if it was rude," she said then, "but I won't beg your pardon for thinking." "What were you thinking?" demanded Miss Minchin. "How dare you think? What were you thinking?" Jessie tittered, and she and Lavinia nudged each other in unison. All the girls looked up from their books to listen. Really, it always interested them a little when Miss Minchin attacked Sara. Sara always said something queer and never seemed the least bit frightened. She was not in the least frightened now, though her boxed ears were scarlet and her eyes were as bright as stars. Boxing someone's ears is when you reach out and slap them suddenly, quickly, on the ear. It really hurts, and it startles. It's not an ongoing hurt, but it's the shock. "I was thinking," she answered grandly and politely, "that you did not know what you were doing." "That I did not know what I was doing?" Miss Minchin fairly gasped. "Yes," said Sara. "And I was thinking what would happen if I were a princess and you boxed my ears, what I should do to you. And I was thinking that if I were one, you would never dare to do it, whatever I said or did, and I was thinking how surprised and frightened you would be if you suddenly found out." She had the imagined future so clearly before her eyes that she spoke in a manner which had an effect even upon Miss Minchin. It almost seemed for the moment to her narrow, unimaginative mind that there must be some real power hidden behind this candid daring. "What?" she exclaimed. "Found out what?" "That I really was a princess," said Sara, "and could do anything I liked." Every pair of eyes in the room widened to its full limit. Lavinia leaned forward on her seat to look. "Go to your room," said Miss Minchin breathlessly. "This instant. Leave this schoolroom. Attend to your lessons, young ladies." Sara made a little bow. "Excuse me for laughing if it was impolite," she said, and walked out of the room, leaving Miss Minchin struggling with her rage and the girls whispering over their books. "Did you see her? Did you see how queer she looked?" Jessie broke out. "I shouldn't be at all surprised if she did turn out to be something. Suppose she should." And that's the end of chapter 11, and I'm going to have a drink of water. What about you? Have you been writing down new words, or, well, old words that you may not have known, or that you weren't sure of, that you want to check out what they really mean? That would be a good idea. They don't have to be new to you. They can be ones that you've heard, but you're not quite sure of them in this context. They might be being used slightly differently to what you're used to. Sorry. I've got little bits of peanut in my mouth, tickling me. Not quite where I'm used to having them. So, we shall continue, since it's only 3:25, with the next chapter. And the next chapter is chapter 12, and it's called The Other Side of the Wall. When one lives in a row of houses, it is interesting to think of the things which are being done and said on the other side of the wall of the very rooms one is living in. So, in London at the time, and there are parts of London that still have this, and other cities too, you have a row of houses along the street where it's one long building, but it's got dividing walls between each house. So one side of a wall is one house, and then the other side of the wall is the next house. So the outside is one building, but the inside you live as if it were separate buildings. That's why Ram Dass was able to climb over the roof to her skylight and come back down in her room, and then go out and go back to his one. It is interesting to think of the things which are being done and said on the other side of the wall of the very rooms one is living in. Sara was fond of amusing herself by trying to imagine the things hidden by the wall which divided the select seminary from the Indian gentleman's house. She knew that the schoolroom was next to the Indian gentleman's study, and she hoped that the wall was thick, so that the noise made, sometimes after lesson hours, would not disturb him. "I am growing quite fond of him," she said to Ermengarde. "I should not like him to be disturbed. I have adopted him for a friend." You can do that with people you never speak to at all. You can just watch them and think about them and be sorry for them until they seem almost like relations. I'm quite anxious sometimes when I see the doctor call twice a day. "I have very few relations," said Ermengarde reflectively, "and I'm very glad of it. I don't like those I have. My 2 aunts are always saying, 'Dear me, Ermengarde, you are very fat. You shouldn't eat sweets.' And my uncle is always asking me things like, 'When did Edward III ascend the throne?' and 'Who died of a surfeit of lampreys?'" Those are history questions. Sara laughed. "People you never speak to can't ask you questions like that," she said, "and I'm sure the Indian gentleman wouldn't even if he was quite intimate with you. I am fond of him." She had become fond of the large family because they looked happy, but she had become fond of the Indian gentleman because he looked unhappy. He had evidently not fully recovered from some very severe illness. In the kitchen, where of course the servants, through some mysterious means, knew everything, there was much discussion of his case. I'm guessing that they gossiped with the servants next door, or down the road at some place like a cafe or a pub, with other servants who'd gossiped with the servants next door. That's often how it works. He was not an Indian gentleman really, but an Englishman who had lived in India. He had met with great misfortunes which had for a time so imperilled his whole fortune that he had thought himself ruined and disgraced for ever. The shock had been so great that he had almost died of brain fever, and ever since he had been shattered in health, though his fortunes had changed and all his possessions had been restored to him. His trouble and peril had been connected with mines. Ooh, that sounds familiar. And mines with diamonds in 'em, said the cook. No savings of mine never goes into no mines, particular diamond ones, with a side glance at Sara. We all know something of them. He felt as my papa felt, Sara thought. He was ill as my papa was, but he did not die. So her heart was more drawn to him than before. When she was sent out at night, she used sometimes to feel quite glad, because there was always a chance that the curtains of the house next door might not yet be closed, and she could look into the warm room and see her adopted friend. When no one was about, she used sometimes to stop, and holding to the iron railings, wish him good night, as if he could hear her. Perhaps you can feel it, if you can't hear, was her fancy. Perhaps kind thoughts reach people somehow, even through windows and doors and walls. Perhaps you feel a little warm and comforted, and don't know why, when I am standing here in the cold, and hoping you will get well and happy again. I am so sorry for you, she would whisper, in an intense little voice. I wish you had a little missus who could pet you as I used to pet Papa when he had a headache. It's just sort of like, oh, you poor thing, like you do with a cat or a dog. I should like to be your little missus myself, poor dear. Good night, good night. God bless you. She would go away feeling quite comforted and a little warmer herself. Her sympathy was so strong that it seemed as if it must reach him somehow as he sat alone in his armchair by the fire, nearly always in a great dressing gown, and nearly always with his forehead resting in his hand as he gazed hopelessly into the fire. He looked to Sara like a man who had a trouble on his mind still, not merely like one whose troubles lay all in the past. He always seems as if he were thinking of something that hurts him now, she said to herself, but he has got his money back and he will get over his brain fever in time, so he ought not to look like that. I wonder if there is something else. If there was something else, something even servants did not hear of, she could not help believing that the father of the large family knew it, the gentleman she called Mr. Montmorency. Mr. Montmorency went to see him often, and Mrs. Montmorency and all the little Montmorencys went too, though less often. He seemed particularly fond of the two elder little girls, the Janet and Nora, who had been so alarmed when their small brother Donald had given Sara his sixpence. He had, in fact, a very tender place in his heart for all children, and particularly for little girls. Janet and Nora were as fond of him as he was of them, and looked forward with the greatest pleasure to the afternoons when they were all allowed to cross the square and make their well-behaved little visits to him. They were extremely decorous little visits because he was an invalid. That means they behaved themselves. Very nicely behaved themselves. He is a poor thing, said Janet, and he says we cheer him up. We try to cheer him up very quietly. Trying not to lose my little tiara. Janet was the head of the family and kept the rest of it in order. It was she who decided when it was discreet to ask the Indian gentleman to tell stories about India, and it was she who saw when he was tired, and it was the time to steal quietly away and tell Ram Dass to go to him. They were very fond of Ram Dass. He could have told any number of stories if he had been able to speak anything but Hindustani. The Indian gentleman's real name was Mr. Carrisford, and Janet told Mr. Carrisford about the encounter with the little girl who was not a beggar. He was very much interested, and all the more so when he heard from Ram Dass of the adventure of the monkey on the roof. Ram Dass had made for him a very clear picture of the attic and its desolateness, of the bare floor and broken plaster, the rusty, empty grate, and the hard, narrow bed. Carmichael, he said to the father of the large family after he had heard this description, I wonder how many of the attics in this square are like that one, and how many wretched little servant girls sleep on such beds, while I toss on my down pillows, loaded and harassed by wealth that is, most of it, not mine. My dear fellow, Mr. Carmichael answered cheerily, the sooner you cease tormenting yourself, the better it will be for you. If you possessed all the wealth of all the Indies, you could not set right all the discomforts in the world, and if you began to refurnish all the attics in the square, there would still remain all the attics in all the other squares and streets to put in order, and there you are. Mr. Carrisford sat and bit his nails as he looked into the glowing bed of coals in the grate. Do you suppose, he said slowly after a pause, do you think it is possible that the other child, the child I never cease thinking of, I believe, could possibly be reduced to any such condition as the poor little soul next door? Mr. Carmichael looked at him uneasily. He knew that the worst thing the man could do for himself, for his reason and his health, that means his mental well-being and his health, was to begin to think in this particular way of this particular subject. If the child at Madame Pascal's school in Paris was the one you are in search of, he answered soothingly, she would seem to be in the hands of people who can afford to take care of her. They adopted her because she had been the favourite companion of their little daughter who had died. They had no other children, and Madame Pascal said that they were extremely well-to-do Russians. And the wretched woman actually did not know where they had taken her, exclaimed Mr. Carrisford. Mr. Carmichael shrugged his shoulders. She was a shrewd, worldly Frenchwoman, and was evidently only too glad to get the child so comfortably off her hands when the father's death left her totally unprovided for. Women of her type do not trouble themselves about the futures of children who might prove burdens. The adopted parents apparently disappeared and left no trace. But you say, if the child was the one I am in search of, you say if, we are not sure. There was a difference in the name. Madame Pascal pronounced it as if it were Carew instead of Crewe, but that might be merely a matter of pronunciation. The circumstances were curiously similar. An English officer in India had placed his motherless little girl at the school. He had died suddenly after losing his fortune. Mr. Carmichael paused a moment as if a new thought had occurred to him. Are you sure the child was left at a school in Paris? Are you sure it was Paris? My dear fellow, broke forth Carrisford with restless bitterness, I am sure of nothing. I never saw either the child or her mother. Ralph Crewe and I loved each other as boys, but we had not met since our school days until we met in India. I was absorbed in the magnificent promise of the mines. He became absorbed too. The whole thing was so huge and glittering that we half lost our heads. When we met, we scarcely spoke of anything else. I only knew that the child had been sent to school somewhere. I do not even remember now how I knew it. He was beginning to be excited. He always became excited when his still weakened brain was stirred by memories of the catastrophes of the past. Mr. Carmichael watched him anxiously. It was necessary to ask some questions, but they must be put quietly and with caution. But you had reason to think the school was in Paris? Yes, was the answer, because her mother was a Frenchwoman, and I had heard that she wished her child to be educated in Paris. It seemed only likely that she would be there. Yes, Mr. Carmichael said, it seems more than probable. The Indian gentleman leaned forward and struck the table with a long, wasted hand. That means it was all thin from him being ill. Carmichael, he said, I must find her. If she is alive, she is somewhere. If she is friendless and penniless, it is through my fault. How is a man to get back his nerve with a thing like that on his mind? This sudden change of luck at the mines has made realities of all our most fantastic dreams. And poor Crewe's child may be begging in the street. No, no, said Carmichael, try to be calm. Console yourself with the fact that when she is found, you have a fortune to hand over to her. Why was I not man enough to stand my ground when things looked black? Carrisford groaned in petulant misery. I believe I should have stood my ground if I had not been responsible for other people's money as well as my own. Poor Crewe had put into the scheme every penny that he owned. He trusted me, he loved me, and he died thinking I had ruined him. I, Tom Carrisford, who played cricket at Eton with him, what a villain he must have thought me. Don't reproach yourself so bitterly. I don't reproach myself because the speculation threatened to fail. I reproach myself for losing my courage. I ran away like a swindler and a thief because I could not face my best friend and tell him I had ruined him and his child. The good-hearted father of the large family put his hand on his shoulder comfortingly. You ran away because your brain had given way under the strain of mental torture, he said. You were half delirious already. If you had not been, you would have stayed and fought it out. You were in a hospital, strapped down in bed, raving with brain fever 2 days after you left the place. Remember that. So he had been very sick, hadn't he? Carrisford dropped his forehead in his hands. Good God, yes, he said. I was driven mad with dread and horror. I had not slept for weeks. The night I staggered out of my house, all the air seemed full of hideous things mocking and mouthing at me. That is explanation enough in itself, said Mr. Carmichael. How could a man on the verge of brain fever judge sanely? Carrisford shook his drooping head. And when I returned to consciousness, poor Crewe was dead and buried. And I seemed to remember nothing. I did not remember the child for months and months. Even when I began to recall her existence, everything seemed in a sort of haze. He stopped a moment and rubbed his forehead. It sometimes seems so now when I try to remember. Surely I must sometime have heard Crewe speak of the school she was sent to. Don't you think so? He might not have spoken of it definitely. You never seem to even have heard her real name. He used to call her by an odd pet name he had invented. He called her his little missus. But the wretched minds drove everything else out of our heads. We talked of nothing else. If he spoke of the school, I forgot. I forgot, and now I shall never remember. Come, come, said Carmichael. We shall find her yet. We will continue to search for Madame Pascal's good-natured Russians. She seemed to have a vague idea that they lived in Moscow. We will take that as a clue. I will go to Moscow. If I were able to travel, I should go with you, said Carrisford, but I can only sit here wrapped in furs and stare at the fire, and when I look into it, I seem to see Carew's happy young face gazing back at me. He looks as if he were asking me a question. Sometimes I dream of him at night, and he always stands before me and asks the same question in words. Can you guess what he says, Carmichael? Mr. Carmichael answered him in a rather low voice. Not exactly, he said. He always says, Tom, old man, Tom, where is the little missus? He caught at Carmichael's hand and clung to it. I must be able to answer him. I must, he said. Help me to find her. Help me. On the other side of the wall, Sara was sitting in her garret, talking to Melchizedek, who had come out for his evening meal. It has been hard to be a princess today, Melchizedek, she said. It has been harder than usual. It gets harder as the weather grows colder and the streets get more sloppy. When Lavinia laughed at my muddy skirt as I passed her in the hall, I thought of something to say all in a flash, and I only just stopped in time. You can't sneer back at people like that if you're a princess, but you have to bite your tongue to hold yourself in. I bit mine. It was a cold afternoon, Melchizedek, and it's a cold night. Quite suddenly she put her black head down in her arms, as she often did when she was alone. Oh, Papa, she whispered, what a long time it seems since I was your little missus. This was what happened that day on both sides of the wall. And that's the end of chapter 12, and we'll have 13 in a moment, or 2. I'm having a drink of water. And are you? Have you got your water handy? Now, just a quick note for those of you who are watching this who aren't Twitch members, you can join Twitch. All you need is an email address and create a password for it, and it doesn't cost you anything to join. And then you can log into Twitch and you can be told when I'm about to stream, because I usually put that starting soon screen up, and it will show you that I'm about to start stories, and then you can click on that link. It will show you right there, and you can do that on your phone. You can actually put an app on your phone for it. You can do that in your browser, on your computer or on your phone, and you can do that with an app on your phone, on your computer as well. So there you go. All these new things you're learning, and they might be useful. And you might find some other people that you can listen to at different times too. Some people read stories, but most people on Twitch play games, computer games. But there are, I think, people who make things, lots of people who make things, and people who create art that you can watch on Twitch as well. So if you join Twitch, you will actually, and then follow those people or like those people, excuse me, when you open the program or the site, it will show you when they're online. Or you can go to their page when they're not streaming and look at one of their previous ones from the last 2 weeks. And I don't actually need to look at my phone. I need to look at my iPad, because that's where the story is. I'm really looking forward to unpacking my boxes of books so that I can use a real book, a real paper and cardboard book, and have the smell of old books while I'm reading to you, and the sound of the pages being turned, and I can turn it round and show you the pictures without having it all shiny from the light on it. Anyway, so here we go. We are reading chapter 13 of A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and chapter 13 is called One of the Populace. Excuse me. The winter was a wretched one. Actually, before I get started, I'm just going to do this because otherwise it's going to fall out and annoy me, or it'll sit even more crooked and annoy you. So if I put this in here, it might not fall out so much because it will be up on top of my head. There you go. So here we go. The winter was a wretched one. There were days on which Sara tramped through snow when she went on her errands. There were worse days when the snow melted and combined itself with mud to form slush. There were others when the fog was so thick that the lamps in the streets were lighted all day, and London looked as it had looked the afternoon several years ago, when the cab had driven through the thoroughfares with Sara tucked up on its seat, leaning against her father's shoulder. On such days the windows of the house of the large family always looked delightfully cosy and alluring, and the study in which the Indian gentleman sat glowed with warmth and rich colour. But the attic was dismal beyond words. There were no longer sunsets or sunrises to look at, and scarcely ever any stars, it seemed to Sara. The clouds hung low over the skylight and were either grey or mud colour, or dropping heavy rain. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, even when there was no special fog, the daylight was at an end. If it was necessary to go to her attic for anything, Sara was obliged to light a candle. The women in the kitchen were depressed, and that made them more ill-tempered than ever. Becky was driven like a little slave. "'Twarn't for you, miss," she said hoarsely to Sara one night when she'd crept into the attic. "'Twarn't for you and the Bastille, and being the prisoner in the next cell, I should die. That there does seem real now, doesn't it? The missus is more like the head jailer every day she lives. I can just see them big keys you say she carries. The cook, she's like one of them under jailers. Tell me some more, please, miss. Tell me about the subterranean passages we've dug under the walls." "I'll tell you something warmer," shivered Sara. "Get your coverlet and wrap it round you." That's like a blanket. "Wrap it round you, and I'll get mine, and we will huddle close together on the bed, and I'll tell you about the tropical forest where the Indian gentleman's monkey used to live." When I see him sitting on the table near the window and looking out into the street with that mournful expression, I always feel sure he is thinking about the tropical forest where he used to swing by his tail from the coconut trees. I wonder who caught him, and if he left a family behind who had depended on him for coconuts. That is warmer, miss, said Becky gratefully, but some ways even the Bastille is sort of heating when you gets to telling about it. That is because it makes you think of something else, said Sara, wrapping the coverlet round her until only her small dark face was to be seen looking out of it. I've noticed this. What you have to do with your mind when your body is miserable is to make it think of something else. Can you do it, miss? Faltered Becky, regarding her with admiring eyes. Sara knitted her brows a moment. Sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't, she said stoutly. But when I can, I'm all right, and what I believe is that we always could, if we practiced enough. I've been practicing a good deal lately, and it's beginning to be easier than it used to be. When things are horrible, just horrible, I think as hard as ever I can of being a princess. I say to myself, I am a princess, and I am a fairy one, and because I am a fairy, nothing can hurt me or make me uncomfortable. You don't know how it makes you forget, she said with a laugh. She had many opportunities of making her mind think of something else, and many opportunities of proving to herself whether or not she was a princess, but one of the strongest tests she was ever put to came on a certain dreadful day which, she often thought afterward, would never quite fade out of her memory, even in the years to come. For several days it had rained continuously. The streets were chilly and sloppy and full of dreary, cold mist. There was mud everywhere, sticky London mud, and over everything the pall of drizzle and fog. That means it had darkened it, had greyed the sky down. The pall. Of course there were several long and tiresome errands to be done. There always were on days like this, and Sara was sent out again and again until her shabby clothes were damp through. The absurd old feathers on her forlorn hat were more draggled and absurd than ever, and her downtrodden shoes were so wet that they could not hold any more water. Added to this, she had been deprived of her dinner because Miss Minchin had chosen to punish her. She was so cold and hungry and tired that her face began to have a pinched look, and now and then some kind-hearted person, passing her in the street, glanced at her with sudden sympathy. But she did not know that. She hurried on, trying to make her mind think of something else. It was really very necessary. Her way of doing it was to pretend and suppose with all the strength that was left in her, but really this time it was harder than she had ever found it, and once or twice she thought it almost made her more cold and hungry instead of less so. But she persevered obstinately, and as the muddy water squelched through her broken shoes, and the wind seemed trying to drag her thin jacket from her, she talked to herself as she walked, though she did not speak aloud or even move her lips. Suppose I had dry clothes on, she thought. Suppose I had good shoes and a long, thick coat, and merino stockings, and a whole umbrella, and suppose, just when I was near a baker's where they sold hot buns, I should find sixpence, which belonged to nobody. Suppose, if I did, I should go into the shop and buy 6 of the hottest buns and eat them all without stopping. Some very odd things happen in this world sometimes. It certainly was an odd thing that happened to Sara. She had to cross the street just when she was saying this to herself. The mud was dreadful. She almost had to wade. She picked her way as carefully as she could, but she could not save herself much. Only, in picking her way, she had to look down at her feet and the mud, and in looking down, just as she reached the pavement, she saw something shining in the gutter. It was actually a piece of silver, a tiny piece trodden upon by many feet, but still with spirit enough left to shine a little. Not quite a sixpence, but the next thing to it, a 4-penny piece. In 1 second it was in her cold little red and blue hand. Wow! I didn't know there was such a thing as a fourpenny piece, but that's okay. I thought they had a threepenny piece. "Oh," she gasped, "it is true, it is true." And then, if you will believe me, she looked straight at the shop directly facing her, and it was a baker's shop, and a cheerful, stout, motherly woman with rosy cheeks was putting into the window a tray of delicious, newly baked, hot buns, direct fresh from the oven, large, plump, shiny buns with currants in them. It almost made Sara feel faint for a few seconds, the shock and the sight of the buns and the delightful odours of warm bread floating up through the baker's cellar window. She knew she need not hesitate to use the little piece of money. It had evidently been lying in the mud for some time, and its owner was completely lost in the stream of passing people who crowded and jostled each other all day long. "But I'll go and ask the baker woman if she has lost anything," she said to herself, rather faintly. So she crossed the pavement and put her wet foot on the step. As she did so, she saw something that made her stop. It was a little figure more forlorn even than herself. A little figure which was not much more than a bundle of rags from which small, bare, red, muddy feet peeped out, only because the rags with which their owner was trying to cover them were not long enough. Above the rags appeared a shock head of tangled hair, that means light-coloured, and a dirty face with huge, hollow, hungry eyes. Sara knew they were hungry eyes the moment she saw them, and she felt a sudden sympathy. "This," she said to herself with a little sigh, "is one of the populace, and she is hungrier than I am." The child, this one of the populace, stared up at Sara as she and shuffled herself aside a little so as to give her room to pass. She was used to being made to give room to everybody. She knew that if a policeman chanced to see her, he would tell her to move on. Sara clutched her little fourpenny piece and hesitated a few seconds. Then she spoke to her. "Are you hungry?" she asked. The child shuffled herself and her rags a little more. "Ain't I just," she said in a hoarse voice, "just ain't I?" "Haven't you had any dinner?" said Sara. "No dinner," more hoarsely still and with more shuffling, "nor yet no breakfast, nor yet no supper, no nothing." "Since when?" asked Sara. "Dunno, never got nothing today, nowhere. I've axed and axed." Just to look at her made Sara more hungry and faint, but those queer little thoughts were at work in her brain, and she was talking to herself, though she was sick at heart. "If I'm a princess," she was saying, "if I'm a princess when they were poor and driven from their thrones, they always shared with the populace. They always shared. Buns are a penny each. If it had been sixpence, I could have eaten 6. It won't be enough for either of us, but it will be better than nothing." "Wait a minute," she said to the bigger child. She went into the shop. It was warm and smelled deliciously. The woman was just going to put some more hot buns into the window. "If you please," said Sara, "have you lost 4pence, a silver 4pence?" And she held the forlorn little piece of money out to her. The woman looked at it, and then at her intense little face, and draggled, once fine clothes. "Bless us, no," she answered. "Did you find it?" "Yes," said Sara, "in the gutter." "Keep it then," said the woman. "It may have been there for a week, and goodness knows who lost it. You could never find out." "I know that," said Sara, "but I thought I would ask you." "Not many would," said the woman, looking puzzled and interested and good-natured all at once. "Do you want to buy something?" she added, as she saw Sara glance at the buns. "4 buns, if you please," said Sara. "Those at a penny each." The woman went to the window and put some in a paper bag. Sara noticed that she put in 6. "I said 4, if you please," she explained. "I have only 4pence." "I'll throw in 2 for make weight," said the woman with her good-natured look. "I dare say you can eat them sometime. Aren't you hungry?" A mist rose before Sara's eyes. "Yes," she answered, "I'm very hungry, and I am much obliged to you for your kindness, and—" She was going to add, "There's a child outside who's hungrier than I am," but just at that moment 2 or 3 customers came in at once, and each one seemed in a hurry. so she could only thank the woman again and go out. The beggar girl was still huddled up in the corner of the step. She looked frightened in her wet and dirty rags. She was staring straight before her with a stupid look of suffering, where your mind is just not working. And Sara saw her suddenly draw the back of her roughened black hand across her eyes to rub away the tears, which seemed to have surprised her by forcing their way from under her lids. She was muttering to herself. Sara opened the bag and took out one of the hot buns, which had already warmed her own cold hands a little. "See," she said, putting the bun in the ragged lap, "this is nice and hot. Eat it, and you will not feel so hungry." The child stared and stared at her as if such sudden, amazing good luck almost frightened her. Then she snatched up the bun and began to cram it into her mouth with great wolfish bites. "Oh my, oh my," Sara heard her say hoarsely in wild delight. "Oh my." Sara took out 3 more buns and put them down. The sound in the hoarse, ravenous voice was awful. "She is hungrier than I am," she said to herself. "She's starving," but her hand trembled when she put down the 4th bun. "I'm not starving," she said, and she put down the 5th. The little ravening London savage was still snatching and devouring when she turned away. She was too ravenous to give any thanks, even if she had ever been taught politeness, which she had not. She was only a poor little wild animal. "Goodbye," said Sara. When she reached the other side of the street, she looked back. The child had a bun in each hand and had stopped in the middle of a bite to watch her. Sara gave her a little nod, and the child, after another stare, a curious, lingering stare, jerked her shaggy head in response, and until Sara was out of sight, she did not take another bite or even finish the one she had begun. At that moment, the baker woman looked out of her shop window. "Well, I never," she exclaimed, "if that young un hasn't given her buns to a beggar child. It wasn't because she didn't want them either. Well, well, she looked hungry enough. I'd give something to know what she did it for." She stood behind her window for a few moments and pondered. Then her curiosity got the better of her. She went to the door and spoke to the beggar child. "Who gave you those buns?" she asked her. The child nodded her head towards Sara's vanishing figure. "What did she say?" inquired the woman. "Ax me if I was hungry," replied the hoarse voice. "What did you say?" "Said I was just." "And then she came in and got the buns and gave them to you, did she?" The child nodded. "How many?" 5. The woman thought it over. "Left just one for herself," she said in a low voice. "And she could have eaten the whole 6. I saw it in her eyes." She looked after the little draggled, faraway figure and felt more disturbed in her usually comfortable mind than she had felt for many a day. "I wish she hadn't gone so quick," she said. "I'm blessed if she shouldn't have had a dozen." Then she turned to the child. "Are you hungry yet?" she answered. "I'm allus hungry," was the answer, "but 'tain't as bad as it was." "Come in here," said the woman, and she held open the shop door. The child got up and shuffled in. To be invited into a warm place full of bread seemed an incredible thing. She did not know what was going to happen. She did not care even. "Get yourself warm," said the woman, pointing to a fire in a tiny back room. "And look here. When you are hard up for a bit of bread, you can come in here and ask for it. I'm blessed if I won't give it to you for that young one's sake." Sara found some comfort in her remaining bun. At all events, it was very hot, and it was better than nothing. As she walked along, she broke off small pieces and ate them slowly to make them last longer. "Suppose it was a magic bun," she said, "and a bite was as much as a whole dinner. I should be overeating myself if I went on like this." It was dark when she reached the square where the select seminary was situated. The lights in the houses were all lighted. The blinds were not yet drawn in the windows of the room where she nearly always caught glimpses of members of the large family. Frequently at this hour she could see the gentleman she called Mr. Montmorency sitting in a big chair with a small swarm around him, talking, laughing, perching on the arms of his seat or on his knees or leaning against them. This evening the swarm was about him, but he was not seated. On the contrary, there was a good deal of excitement going on. It was evident that a journey was to be taken, and it was Mr. Montmorency who was to take it. A brougham stood before the door, and a big portmanteau had been strapped upon it. That's a big carry chest or basket, like a packing case. Luggage. It's a form of luggage that could hold lots and lots of things. A big portmanteau had been strapped upon it. The children were dancing about and chattering and hanging on to their father. The pretty, rosy mother was standing near him, talking as if she were asking finer questions. Sara paused a moment to see the little ones lifted up and kissed, and the bigger ones bent over and kissed also. I wonder if he will stay away long, she thought. That portmanteau is rather big. Oh dear, how they will miss him. I shall miss him myself, even though he doesn't know I am alive. When the door opened, she moved away, remembering the sixpence, but she saw the traveller come out and stand against the background of the warmly lighted hall, the older children still hovering about him. Will Moscow be covered with snow? Said the little girl Janet. Will there be ice everywhere? Shall you drive in a drosky? Cried another. Shall you see the Tsar? That's the person who used to rule the country in Russia, like a king in England. I will write and tell you all about it, he answered, laughing, and I will send you pictures of musics and things. I'm not sure what that one is. We'll have to look it up. Run into the house. It's a hideous damp night. I would rather stay with you than go to Moscow. Good night, duckies. God bless you. And he ran down the steps and jumped into the brougham. If you find the little girl, give her our love, shouted Guy Clarence, jumping up and down on the doormat. Then they went in and shut the door. Did you see, said Janet to Nora as they went back into the room, the little girl who was not a beggar was passing. She looked all cold and wet, and I saw her turn her head over her shoulder and look at us. Mamma says her clothes always look as if they've been given to her by someone who was quite rich, someone who only let her have them because they were too shabby to wear. The people at the school always send her out on errands on the horridest days and nights there are. Sara crossed the square to Miss Minchin's area steps, feeling faint and shaky. I wonder who the little girl is, she thought, the little girl he's going to look for. And she went down the area steps, lugging her basket, and finding it very heavy indeed, as the father of the large family drove quickly on his way to the station to take the train, which was to carry him to Moscow, where he was to make his best efforts to search for the lost little daughter of Captain Crewe. And that's the end of chapter 13. And I'm going to stop there because I've been reading for an hour. Wow, so many things going on. We can see who's who. They can't. Oh my goodness. How long is he going to be in Moscow? What's going to happen so that they find out that she is Sara Crewe, that she is the daughter of Captain? Oh my goodness, how's it going to work out? Don't tell anyone if you already know the answer, if you've already heard the story or seen the TV series or the movie. Don't spoil it for anyone. Anyway, have you written down your list of words that you're going to look up? I'm sorry, I've been reading so much I haven't written any down, but I hope you have. If you go over to our Discord channel, which is linked somewhere on my profile, probably down below, if you're looking at this on Twitch, and if you're looking at this on YouTube, my link will bring you here to Twitch, and then on Twitch you'll look at my profile down below and there's a link to my Discord server, which will actually, Discord will give you a place that you can chat with other people who've been listening to the stories. So if you've got any new words that you wanted to find out about, you can write them down over there. Actually, I'm going to start a new section on the Discord server, so you can write down your new words and maybe guess what you thought you used to think they meant, if you had any clues, and then you can also write down what they actually meant or what they might have meant at the time this story was written. So you're most welcome to come and join us. You'll need to actually sign up for a free Discord account if you haven't already got one. Same as having a free YouTube account or a free Twitch account. And you'll just need an email address to be able to sign up. And then you can join in the conversations over there. And sometimes I'm over there and sometimes I write in conversations with people too. We can chat there together. So when we're here, you can chat to each other in the chat box there. If you're on YouTube, you can chat down below. But when I'm offline, I won't see that chat because it only shows me from the start of when I go back online again. So the best place if you want to chat with people is over on our Discord server. And it's jevvz that you're probably looking for if you're trying to find me over there. So great to have you here. Look forward to seeing you again, which for me is going to be on Monday. And we will find out what's going to happen. What are they going to tell us? Because we're about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the book. Are we going to find out in the next chapter what happened? Or is there going to be something else that's going to happen? Going by the way it's gone so far in this story, we'll probably find out about some other things, not what we really, really, really want to know, which is that they find her and they rescue her. Yet. That'll come, I'm sure, but not just yet. I think there's a few more twists and turns to our story. I hope that man next door gets better soon. Anyway, so we'll see you next time. Don't forget to come back again. Bye.